This is Linux in Laws, a podcast on topics around free and open source software, any associated contraband, communism, the revolution in general, and whatever else fancies your tickle. Please note that this and other episodes may contain strong language, offensive humor, and other certainly not politically correct language. You have been warned. Our parents insisted on this disclaimer. Happy, Mum? Thus, the content is not suitable for consumption in the workplace, especially when played back on a speaker in an open plan office or similar environments. Any minors under the age of 35, or any pets, including fluffy little killer bunnies, your trusted guide dog, unless on speed, and cute T-Rexes or other associated dinosaurs. Welcome to Linux In-Laws Season 2. I forgot the episode. Martin, what about you? Do you kind of recall the episode?
It's kind of 25 or something in that kind of region.
It's an episode number within the interval of 1 and 99.
It's definitely not one for the series 2. We've done about 15, I think, for series 2.
No, actually, the other day somebody got in touch basically about the episode number. I think it was 12 or 11 or something like that. So it must be, the interval must be actually starting at 12 or 4 or 13 or something like that. But this is not about episode numbers, but rather about a very interesting open source project by the name of, Martin?
It's called the Chaos Project, which is, of course, an abbreviation, but I think that's better for our guests to explain, to be honest.
So why don't we let the guests introduce themselves?
Yeah, so I can start. I am Dawn Foster. I am on the governing board for the CHAOSS project, which does stand for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. So 2 S's at the end of CHAOSS. I am within the CHAOSS project. I am on the governing board, as I mentioned. I'm also the director of data science. I also hold a few other positions within open source. I'm on the board of Open UK. I am based here just outside of London. I'm also co-chair of the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group. And I've spent well over 20 years working in open source, mostly for a variety of different companies, with a small detour to get a PhD where I studied the Linux kernel and collaboration within the Linux kernel.
Very interesting project.
Yeah.
And subject too, I might add. Sean?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sean Goggins. I'm one of the co-creators of the CHAOSS project and professor of computer science at the University of Missouri in the United States. I'm also on the CHAOSS board, and I've been researching open source software for about 15 years now.
So open source veterans by the sound of it. Yeah. And before we get the project even more wrong, why don't you explain to the 2 listeners in the audience who do not know what CHAOSS is? I reckon if anybody is developing software, you probably know CHAOSS, but just with 1 S, I suppose. So, but this is spelled with 2 S. So why don't you give us a short overview of the project, if you will?
It's Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. That's the decoding of the acronym. The project began because there was an interest in understanding how to tell the difference between an open source project that is healthy and sustainable and how to perhaps predict when an open source project is potentially flailing or losing support from developers or firms, and to understand what perhaps the antecedents are to the decline of an open source project. And that's where we started, and since then we created over 80 metrics, which are discrete measures of things like commits or commit comments or pull request comments. Anything that you can think to measure about an open source project, CHAOSS measures, and we assemble those metrics, which are discrete little pieces, into models and also into how to use them, which are the practitioner guides, which Dawn is the creator of.
Yeah, so one of the things that the CHAOSS project historically, we've been very focused on collecting metrics, defining those metrics, and collecting them using several tools. So we have Augur, which is the tool that Sean is the maintainer of, and I think we'll talk about the tools later. We also have another tool called Grimoire Lab. So we have two tools that are used to collect the metrics. And then we have a whole bunch of metrics and metrics models that people can use. But what we found was that what we were really creating with these 80 plus metrics was kind of an overwhelming tsunami of data, as I think Sean has put it in the past. And what we found is that, there are a few people who really like to dig into all of that data, who can make sense out of it and use what they've learned to make improvements to their open source projects. And then there's a whole set of other people who just feel overwhelmed and give up and don't really do anything with the data that they have about their open source projects. So the practitioner guides were designed to solve that problem. So they're really designed for people who are relatively new to open source, maybe people who are relatively new to looking at open source data. And the practitioner guides are across a few different topics. So responsiveness, contributor sustainability, organizational participation, and we have a new guide for security that will launch in a couple of weeks. And they're really designed to get people started with those topics, get people started measuring, say, responsiveness, and then looking at where they can improve the responsiveness of their project. So the practitioner guides are something new and are really designed to help people get started and figure out where they can improve their project based on the data that they have.
Now, before we go through these metrics one by one, and I reckon that shouldn't take longer than about 5 hours in total. No jokes aside, we should touch upon the metrics in a minute or two. But I'm just wondering about, was there any compelling event, so to speak, that kicked the whole thing off in terms of how did you come about the requirement to give birth to something called chaos, in terms of was there a single event or something like that triggered you to sit down and think about this very thoroughly? Because I looked at the metrics, and the metrics are just awesome and impressive, but as I said, we're going to cover them in a minute. But I'm just wondering, what was the rationale behind the initial project, if you can speak to this?
It started with a Birds of a Feather session at the Linux Foundation Members Summit in 2015. Is that right? 2016. And Matt German-Prey and Georg Link were there. Georg was Matt's student at the time. Matt's one of the other co-founders, and he's at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And they just put it on a whiteboard, metrics for open source, and 40 people showed up. And that was the beginning. That the event was this overwhelming interest that I'm not sure they really expected.
Yeah, and we had a lot of these tools beforehand. So Augur was something Sean was already working on. The Grimoire Lab, which is the other piece of software under the Chaos project, was something that a group in Spain under the company called Bitergia, which is where Georg Link now works. They had another set of software tools that were used to gather metrics. And so we've had all of these tools, but what the beauty of the Chaos project, I think, was pulling those two tools together into one project where we could come up with consistent definitions of metrics within the Chaos project.
I'm just maybe now's the time to touch actually upon these metrics. Needless to say, people links will be in the show notes. But Chaos organizes the metrics into so-called topic areas like organizational platform, software, contribution event, and so forth. As I said, we probably won't go through them all, the 80 plus metrics that you have. But when I take a look,
they're quite well defined on the website anyway, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So links will be, of course, in the show notes. But when I take a look at these metrics, I think I've yet to come across the metric that isn't covered. Needless to say, with that sort of massive data, you end up with a data lake for each and every project, I suppose, that you subject to these things. So I'm just wondering, how much of these metrics do you actually collect for any given project? And equally important, probably, what was the first project that you started with? And what was the outcome when you started to collect these metrics in terms of how did you distribute the data? How did the project maintainers receive the data, if they did? And what happened afterwards?
I think there's a lot to unpack there in that question. Please. That's a very big question. I would start with, if you can imagine, the first thing that we did was to define these metrics, right? And you would think a commit, everybody knows what a commit is. Wrong. There were a half a dozen different ways that people counted or didn't count different kinds of commits. And that meant that anybody who was measuring open source using this commit, for example, as a measure, might be doing it differently. So there was no real way to compare across data collection tools or even data sets the commit count for a project. And so we started by creating a common definition for things like a commit, which were then implemented consistently in tools like Grimoire Lab and Augur. And as we chugged through these 80 different metrics and collected them, we began to build, as you described it, a data lake. And these data lakes are, to Don's earlier point, this overwhelming tidal wave of information that people can't make sense of. And so that led us to, once we had these common definitions and all of this data, we started to work towards ways of helping people collect and identify the things that were of greatest interest to them.
Yeah, and and even like I said, these tools have existed long before the Chaos Project was actually founded. And so, I used to use the Grimoire Lab tools at Puppet when I worked at Puppet. So I think we brought them in via Bitergia in around 2013 or so, and I was using them directly with the open source community. So we had dashboards. I was doing reports and sharing them with the broader community about what was going on within the Puppet community. We were sharing those also a kind of a different set with executives and the board, just to let them know what was happening within the Puppet open source community. So, in my background, so my background is not necessarily just doing research on open source projects. I've generally been involved in a lot of the projects that I was collecting metrics on. So in my case, I was working closely with the maintainers and other contributors within these projects to help them understand what was going on within the projects that we were working on and find areas where we could improve.
So you have these various groups or categories of metrics, right? I mean, as let's say in accountancy, people like to roll up things to one number. Has there been any initiative to put like an overall, this is the health number for Puppet, right? Rather than saying the community part is that healthy, or the metrics for this or that. Are you working towards that? Is that something that you're trying to achieve, or?
I would say no, and I would say that I've been actively resistant towards doing that, because I believe that every open source project is different, and I think that metrics require interpretation in light of the other things that are going on within a project. So for example, if you're looking at things like responsiveness, I expect those numbers to go down in November, December, if you're talking about a project with a lot of people, around Thanksgiving and Christmas in the U.S. or Christmas in, in other parts of the world. So I expect those numbers to go down, and I actually kind of think that's a good thing, because it probably means that people are taking time off and they're not as responsive to things going on in the community because they're spending time with family, maybe. Or, looking at data from a community, you might look at something and be like, wow, the community really went downhill at this point, but maybe it was just that everyone was on vacation contingent in China, and it was Chinese New Year where everybody takes a week off. So I really think that you need to look at all of the other things that are going on within a project. And, maybe, so there were some cases when I worked at VMware where the activity in a project might go down for a month or two, but it was because everybody was working on something else, or maybe there was a big release. There was some good reason for people not to be working on the open source project at the time. And I think that's just fine. I think it's good and healthy to look at the data that way and tell stories around it based on all of the stuff that's happening within the community.
That doesn't mean that we aren't constantly asked for that one dashboard scorecard to beat all dashboard scorecards. it is a constant request that people have. And what we've said, as Don points out, we call it, you have to use the context, your knowledge of the project to make sense of these metrics. That's kind of the important part. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't groups like, or research projects within CHAOSS. I know Don's looking at some forks right now. Some of my research group is looking at, which CHAOSS metrics over time potentially together provide a signal of impending risk or impending abandonment of a project. So we are, my group is doing research to try to understand that. Don's doing research to try to understand what leads to these, what I'd call hostile fork situations. And so we are certainly interested in this question. It's just that we don't have a cookbook right now. And I think that because open source is not really one thing, corporatized open source has a collective pattern of behaviors that we can monitor, but the way that these metrics appear in scientific open source or open source run by the United Nations is different. The patterns of contribution and use just vary depending on the specific open source context.
And I think when you try to boil some of this down to say a single number or, red, green, good, bad, that tends to encourage people to compare them to other projects. And at least in corporate environments, I've too often really seen that weaponized by management, where they try to punish people based on the fact that their number is, red for whatever reason, or not as quote unquote good as some other project. But those projects are very different. And so I think you need to look at them individually and look at where they are, where they're going, what their purpose is, what they're trying to achieve, and be able to use the data to drive meaningful improvements. So that's usually my focus when it comes to at least the CHAOSS metrics, because a lot of them are very focused on project health, is find something within your project that you can make better and use the data to do that. And so that's always my focus. And by focusing on that, it makes it harder for people to weaponize those metrics or to use them in ways where they're maybe punishing people, because I don't like that.
Yeah. No, I think where I was getting at with that question is really, so who does that interpretation, right? And because if we think about examples like some open source projects are, as you mentioned, pretty much enterprise-led, right? They're mainly almost all the contributors and the management of the project is with one company. Another one is, as you mentioned, responsiveness and maintenance of the project, right? So those could be potential red flags, right? So how does that interpretation happen, and who does this piece? Let's say the open SSL example, right? Where there's there was two people or one people, and they were doing it on the side, and there wasn't enough maintenance happening, and then those kind of things happen. Is that something that you could pick up on with your metrics?
So it is. The people who do most of the interpretation are either open source program offices or maintainers or community managers responsible for the projects. And I think in your OpenSSL example, all of those things did not exist. So there was, even if there were CHAOSS metrics, nobody was looking at them.
Yeah.
And I think, we've had people within the project look at like the XZ social hack that happened, and were there any signals ahead of time that we could have noticed that we didn't? And I think as these kind of social hacks and other phenomena occur, they give us places to look and things to look at, so that if things similar occur again, perhaps we might see them coming. And what CHAOSS metrics really do at that very high level is they give people interested in the health of the project a window that isn't otherwise visible, a window that enables comparison, a window that enables looking at things over time in some degree of detail. And that's just not available on the Git platforms or in other places.
And that's the real challenge, right? I mean, where do you look for those unexpected things that might happen? How do you know to look at Elasticsearch before they relicense it? How do you know to look at XZ before there's this big vulnerability? And that's the hard part, right? I mean, because we tend to look at and have data on individual projects, and how do you decide which ones to look at that might be interesting in the future, aside from the ones that you're working on?
You already named a few projects, which is very interesting. But the question begs, of course, what was the most challenging / complex / riveting project, for want of a better description, that you've come across and took a very hardcore look at with regards to the overall health?
There hasn't been one project, I would say. I think this has been a progressive and evolving collection of interested parties moving from corporate worlds into worlds of government or public interest. So the groups trying to make sense of this differ. And when people try to make sense of open source projects, I think the natural human tendency is to make comparisons. So I have this project that I'm interested in. What are the other projects that are either in this space or have similar origins? And let me compare my project to those to see how I look side by side, something that I think is on par with what I am doing. And that kind of comparison lends itself to, for example, really there are, I think, reference communities. And Dawn earlier mentioned her role on the CNCF. And I think one of the things organized foundation projects like the CNCF provide are human-coded gateways or gates that projects have to go through, from a sandbox to incubating to graduated. And other projects can then look at those gateways or those gates and compare their projects with them to see, how am I more like a sandbox project? Am I more like an incubating project? So finding those reference points and helping people see them, I think, is one thing that's helpful.
And there are some interesting projects that I'm looking at right now. So as Sean mentioned, I've been kind of digging into a couple of examples of big projects that have relicensed that then resulted in hostile forks. So I'm currently looking at some data to better understand what happens both before and after the relicensing, and what happens when one of these projects is forked, and what does that look like. And I haven't finished the analysis, but the bit that I've been working on is looking at organizational diversity, so the companies that these people work for. And it's interesting to compare if you look at Elasticsearch, for example, versus Redis. So Elasticsearch, the Elastic employees contribute like 97%. They make like 97% of the contributions to Elasticsearch. So when they licensed, there really wasn't a big impact on the community itself. And you see that playing out in the fork, right? So the fork was created by a group within Amazon AWS, OpenSearch, to be a substitute for the users. But they didn't really have people who were currently contributing to Elasticsearch to really kind of spawn that fork. They happened to have one person who used to work at Elastic who helped a lot with the fork. But that was a really interesting dynamic when you compare it to Redis, for example. So when they relicensed, they had quite a few people contributing from other organizations. So they had contributors from companies like Ericsson and Amazon and Alibaba. And you look at the Redis data both before and after the relicense, and these people were contributing to Redis before they relicensed, and you see the contributions from non-Redis employees just drop to almost zero after the relicense, and you see those individuals move over to the Valkey fork. So in this case, the fork was under the Linux Foundation as a foundation project, and you can see the diversity of contributions coming from the people who were contributing to Redis who have now moved to the fork. So I'm finding that data to be really, really fascinating to look at. And like I said, I'm just starting to dig into it, so I don't have any big conclusions, but at some point in the coming months, I should have a little more data.
Spending 2 more minutes on Redis because it's probably the project closest to Martin's and my heart. So for want of a better description there, because full disclosure, for these two people in the audience who haven't listened to the whole podcast episode, Linda's in-laws is essentially a baby of the time Martin and myself spent at Redis, or Redis Labs as it was then called. So we met there. And I reckon it's still the company basically where we came up with the idea of doing an open source podcast, let's put it this way.
Indeed.
Given the fact that...
However, don't forget Postgres.
we did meet at EDB, very important.
Okay, good. Carry on.
You defected to this NoSQL company called Redis Labs, right? So fair enough. Anyway, jokes aside, people. Now, for those two people who haven't been following the news recently, we should probably kind of explain what happened. Redis was under a, I think, 3-clause BSD license and changed their license to source code available, if I'm not completely mistaken. Details may or may not be in the show notes, but immediately, as Dawn already explained, the project was forked by quite a few people and is now under the auspices, for want of a better description, of the Linux Foundation, which tells you a little bit about the importance of that code base. Now, moving forward, it would be interesting to see how this is going, because Redis, and I'm not revealing any secrets here, is probably the caching solution most popular for such use cases on GitHub. Because if you take a look at the requirements of any project using caches, more than likely you have either Memcached or Redis as a caching solution as a requirement for a project. And Redis is probably also the NoSQL database with the most client-side implementations. Maybe not, I don't know. It was at the time when I was working there anyway. And it would be very interesting to see what's going to happen with said fork, because in contrast to some other projects, this fork happened more or less immediately. Redis announced a license change, and only a few days later, maybe a week or two, the project was forked. In terms of, I think it was version 7.1 or 7.2, if I'm completely mistaken. So, Dawn and Sean, it would be very interesting, and we must bring you back in about a fortnight, I'm joking, to see what happened. To see what happened to this code base with regards to the facts that Dawn and Sean talked about.
Yeah, it's really interesting because like you said, a lot of people are using Redis. And what I'm looking at it so far, what I've been looking at is mostly what happened to the contributors as a result of the relicensing and the fork. But I think the really interesting piece, which is also really pretty hard to measure, is the adoption of the fork. So what we've seen in the past is that it's the adoption is the part that is really, really difficult, not just to measure, but it's really difficult to get adoption of a fork like this. So I'm not sure really how many people are using OpenSearch, for example. I think a lot of people have continued to use Elasticsearch under their new license, under the server-side public license. And I'll be curious to see how many people continue to use Redis under their new license as well, which I'm also forgetting. I think it was the server-side public license along with a custom license. So they've got kind of a dual licensing situation similar to what Elasticsearch has. And so the really interesting piece will be to look at the adoption of the fork. And does it really take much from Redis, or is it mostly the people who are interested in contributing to it and using it for their own needs, and we don't know that yet, right? Because the fork is still pretty new. It was launched end of March. So March 28th was when it was launched. So that doesn't give people a lot of time to decide whether or not it's going to be as good, as stable as whatever to be used in their production environments. And even though it's kind of a drop-in replacement, it's still a big decision for companies.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say what was interesting to see about the Valkey part. What's happening now is the upcoming release of 8, right? Where, for example, some Amazon contributors are adding multi-threading to it. So it's not just let's take the code base and maintain it as is. There's also specifically in this project, a lot of new developments going in, which is presumably going to help the adoption. But obviously, time will tell. Sorry, Sean.
When we use Redis and Augur, which is one of the metrics tools in the Chaos project as a caching solution, and I've looked at the migration path to Valky, I'm just waiting for the documentation of that to become more mature so that I can just basically switch it out. And so the other thing is we don't collect, it's really hard to collect this telemetry data to determine use. So a lot of what we learn about how a project like Redis is replaced with a project like Valky comes from people describing their experiences. It doesn't emerge very clearly from data because that use data isn't widely available. And so that creates a certain challenge.
Yeah, and because the Chaos project, we're an open source project, and we do try to use as much open source technology as we can. It's interesting, Sean is looking at Valky as the Redis fork, and in the case of Grimoire Lab, they have switched from Elasticsearch to OpenSearch, and they did that a while ago. So it's interesting to see that both of the forks that I'm looking at, coincidentally enough, are ones that we're looking at or using within the Chaos project itself.
And I think it's important to point out that both of these license changes went from an OSI standard license, a license that the OSI sanctions as an open source license, and switched to non-OSI compliant licenses. And in my view, this is just an opinion, I don't represent the project here, but in my view, there's a broken promise there. There's a broken open source promise when you switch to a license that's not really an open source.
I mean, from a technical perspective, because full disclosure, I too contributed to some portion of the project, you had to sign a CLA, Contributors License Agreement,
right.
That specifically basically said that you are okay with any future license changes. So right. From a technical perspective, I reckon there's little you can do about it. But Salvatore Sanfilippo, the initial founder or person, software developer is probably the right word. Salvatore, if you're listening, please write in if we got this wrong. No, jokes aside, I mean, he said that explicitly Redis will always be covered by a BSD license as a permissive copyright license, permissive software license. We're going to cut this out. Permissive software license that allows you to incorporate said code base in any shape or fashion as governed by this BSD license in your tech stack. And to some extent, I do concur, Sean, that this is a broken promise.
I don't know any other way to look at it. I think if you're producing open source software and basically selling the idea of it and building your adoption on that promise, and there's no question that Elasticsearch and Redis built their user base, partly at least, on the premise that it was an open source project. And that's just hard to escape the change. And that's why these projects get forked and others move on to the forked version of it.
And this is one of the things that I'm hoping that, some of these unfortunate decisions, the relicensing decisions, I hope will cause people to think more about who owns some of these projects before they contribute to them and before they start using them. Because, it's not just the relicensing. There are lots of things that can happen when these projects are effectively owned by a single company, especially a relatively smallish company that needs, is put under a lot of pressure to make money from their investors. And, and it's not just that, like companies change strategy, companies go out of business. There are lots and lots of reasons why companies can make these decisions and sort of pull the rug out from under the rest of us who might be contributing or using some of these projects. And I really do hope that people will start thinking more critically about who controls that project before they start using it. And this is part of what I talk about in that practitioner guide for organizational participation is how to look at this and how to think about what could go wrong and what risks you might be taking.
There is, of course, the risk of an organization that contributes heavily to a open source project being taken over by another company who's less inclined to, support open source initiatives. you've worked at VMware.
Yep.
There is, of course, RabbitMQ, which is pretty much 99% maintained by VMware employees. So is that something that you would flag up in your metric or your assessment of in the practitioner's guide, is for people to look at these kind of ownerships, or what are the main projects, how the project is organized, governed, to decide whether to become a contributor?
I do think it's important to, when a company is acquired by another company, look at the culture of the acquiring firm.
Yeah.
So, my opinion here, just my opinion, you look at Broadcom and their history, and they're the acquirers of VMware. Their history is what I'd characterize as a milking the cow kind of history, where they purchase companies, they purchase a customer list, and then they shutter a whole bunch of technology and optimize the whole operation to the most money with the least cost. That's what they're doing. And so when you see a company that's a cow milker come for your open source project, there's a good chance you need to look elsewhere in short order.
Yeah, and it doesn't just impact the open source projects that are, owned or controlled by that particular company. It also impacts the broader ecosystem and projects that are under foundations. This is something we saw with some of the CNCF projects, because there were some projects that VMware had contributed to the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And after the Broadcom acquisition, a lot of the employees were no longer working on a couple of those open source projects. And so it created problems for those projects, even though they were owned by one of these big foundations. But because a lot of the people who are making a lot of the changes worked for a company that was no longer supporting that work, it made it hard to get that work done within those CNCF projects. And we've seen this with other projects. There was an example where Grafana forked, I think, Cortex and put it into a new project called Mimir, and basically effectively pulled all of their employees out of that open source CNCF project. And some other people came in and contributed and have kind of kept it alive. But it's not just about who owns the project. It is also who contributes to it, which is why we have metrics like the elephant factor, for example, which looks at the organization's employees at organizations who are participating in a project and whether or not that project is dominated by the employees at a particular organization. So we use the elephant factor metric for that.
Just going back to the Broadcom VMware example, Augur collects data for 100,000 plus repositories regularly. VMware's on that list. Over the summer, hundreds, if not over 1,000 repositories moved from the VMware organization to the VMware-archive organization. There are now only 148 repositories in VMware on GitHub and over 2,000 in VMware-archive. So there was a mass movement of technology to basically an archive state.
Do you see the same with the contributions to those projects?
I have not dug into the contribution patterns, but I think that would be interesting.
We can probably assume something, but
VMware had a lot of projects that were really only contributed to by VMware employees, and so my guess is that a lot of those archived ones might have fit that pattern, but that's not always true. I mean, one of the things when I worked in the open source program office there is we would talk people out of archiving projects because there were just too many other people involved in the project for us to just be like, nah, we're good, we're going to archive it. And so we talked people out of that. And then, when Broadcom acquired VMware, they got rid of most of the open source program office. So there may or may not have been someone there to talk people out of archiving projects that maybe shouldn't have been. And I don't know, I'll admit I haven't dug into that data. No,
I haven't dug into it either. I noticed it because those kinds of relocations pop. When a repository moves an org, they kind of show up for me when I look at Augur.
Okay. Certainly make a good article of the
Now, changing tack a little bit, given the fact that you are under the auspices of the Linux Foundation, which in itself is probably the biggest industry association in the Linux/FLOSS space. Are there any touch points from the industry itself, as in have companies been approaching you with regards to, okay, this sounds like a very interesting approach, and we do have some open source projects, and so let's give it a go and see what can these metrics contribute to the overall health of these code bases that we maintain, contribute to, have in the open?
Yeah, I would say our relationship with the Linux Foundation is fairly light touch. So they have never told us, you have to work only with Linux Foundation members or something like that. We are pretty much free to, work with whoever we want in whatever way we want. They provide us with some nice benefits, like giving us space to do some conferences and things like that. But for the most part, you wouldn't necessarily, when we're working on projects, you wouldn't necessarily know that we were a Linux Foundation project. So I would say that they give us a lot of freedom to do kind of what we need to do. And with that said, we have several working groups that are focused on different, what we call contexts. So people using our metrics and our tools in different ways. Probably the biggest one right now has been, and historically has been, our corporate open source program office working group. So we have loads of people from, Verizon and Microsoft and Google and Red Hat, name lots of big tech companies you can think of, and a lot of them are involved in this OSPO, Open Source Program Office working group that we have, talking about how they use the metrics. And then more recently, we've spun ones up to talk where it's a group of people who work at university open source program offices, which have very different needs. And then Sean also runs one for scientific and research software as well. So we have these different groups where we're talking about how to use metrics and what's important in those contexts. And I find those meetings really interesting.
Excellent. Interesting, because I think I would have thought that would have been more kind of outreach from the industry, because at the end of the day, if I take chaos as a yardstick, if you will, your approach seems to be ideal to check out my contributions to the overall FLOSS ecosystem in terms of what's happening with the project. Am I doing it correctly? Do I have the right approach to open sourcing code bases?
I think there is a tremendous, I wouldn't characterize it as necessarily outreach from the industry. However, I would say that the Chaos Project really originates from the needs of industry. And there are lots of companies using our metrics in different ways, using different tools to measure them. And in many cases, the tools that we've built. In other cases, perhaps things like the OpenSSF's scorecard are widely used, incorporated into some of our tools. So I do think there's I don't know if it's outreach or what the word is, but the Chaos Project really originates from an industry need, is maybe the way to say that.
Yeah, and I would say we collaborate really closely with industry and to better understand what they need, how we can evolve our metrics and our software and things like the practitioner guides to be more useful for the people who want to better understand their participation in open source projects and in the broader ecosystem.
Talking about working groups, you have various events and conferences as well, right? That are really to discuss the metrics and the working and the practitioners' guides, things like that. Is that how you operate? Is that or is it all done in a, let's say, a traditional open source project kind of way, where people work together through, let's say, like software development as well, right? You say have that same kind of approach model.
Yeah, I think we have a mix, right? So we have lots of working groups where people get together and they meet and they talk about things. We also have, for each of those working groups, we have repositories. So I also co-chair the data science working group, and we have a repository around that where we're also collaborating together on things like data sets that are interesting to people who care about open source project health data. So we, and then, the metrics are defined. We have repositories where we do that as well. And so, if you make a change to a metric, it ends up being a pull request to the project that gets then pulled into the changes get pulled into the website where they get displayed. And then certainly the software projects are run in a kind of a traditional open source fashion. And then we do have conferences. So we usually do the Thursday before FOSDEM in Europe. And then we have a second one that we co-locate with the Linux Foundation's Open Source Summit for North America. So we do one in Europe, one in North America, and the Linux Foundation generously gives us space at their venue to do the other CHAOSScon at Open Source Summit North America. So we have those two events, and then of course we participate in lots of other events. I give probably way too many talks about chaos metrics at all kinds of different events. So I would say it's kind of a mix. And we have a pretty active Slack channel, for example. So we have a Slack workspace with channels for each of our working groups where people get together and they talk about things. So I would say we work asynchronously in sort of a traditional open source fashion, but we also have lots of meetings where people can just get together and talk about things.
Great. And so in terms of let's say the health of the contributions to working groups, do you have any further requirements to add more topics, further contributions? In short, is there anything you want to plug for people to help with on the chaos side?
I think we're always for people to contribute to the software.
Yes, the call for action.
Yes, for sure. So yeah, as Sean mentioned, we really would like people to contribute to the software. And okay. So yeah, I would encourage people to have a look there. We also encourage people to help us improve our metrics. And if there's a metric that you'd like to see that isn't already in our list, you can help us develop that new metric. We're also looking for help with the practitioner guides. So we're always looking for feedback on ways to improve them. We have several that we would like to do that haven't been started yet. So you can find those in the data science working group repository for chaos. We have some proposals for things that people can work on. And so, I think there's lots of ways people can get involved. I think, dropping into one of our meetings is an easy way to get a feel for the types of things that we're working on and what might be a good fit for you. So we have weekly all community meetings. So it's just kind of a general community meeting on every Tuesday. So that's a good place. That's a good place to start. If you don't know where you want to get engaged in the project, showing up to that meeting gives you kind of a sense for a lot of the stuff that's going on. But there's so many ways to contribute. And we have people working on, like I said, metrics definitions, which doesn't require any coding. We have people working on things like design and, data analysis. So it's not just a traditional code contributions that we're looking for. There's lots of other ways people contribute, developing educational materials, project management. There are loads of ways to contribute to chaos.
When I looked at the metrics, speaking of metrics, I noticed a missing metric actually, in terms of how much code was actually contributed by non-human life forms in terms of extraterrestrials. So I didn't find this in the metrics. Maybe you want to include this now. I'm joking, right?
So like bots, if you're talking about bots, for example, we do have, those are a filter or a parameter on many metrics. So there isn't a single metric that says "show me the extraterrestrials."
Excellent.
But we do have an extraterrestrial.
I was joking, right?
Yeah.
We do actually have a bot activity metric.
But yes, exactly. Jokes aside, in the era of ChatGPT and all the rest of them, beyond bots, how much code would have been contributed by artificial intelligence? That would be a slightly more serious metric worth including, I suppose.
Well,
that would be interesting.
And GAI tools, they aren't sentient yet, right? So they aren't out there looking for problems in code and submitting pull requests as directed entities. They are tools that are leveraged by developers. And this is so emergent right now. There are projects who have created policies about how to note that you used AI. I think there are a lot more projects that have developers looking to solve problems. They use AI to understand the error message, and then they fix the problem. And so I think AI is in the loop. We just don't understand the extent to which it's in the loop because that part is a little bit behind the human making a decision to use it.
Interesting. Any final thoughts from your side, Martin, before we wrap this up in terms of the proxies?
Yeah, the only thing we haven't really covered is what's next for the Chaos project, right? So if there's anything, you've been around for 8 years, something like that. Are you well established? Is there any major changes coming up in the near future for Chaos?
I think the direction that Don has charted with the practitioner guides is a response to how people want to use Chaos. So I think with the increasing uptake, there's always the challenge of helping people just starting out make sense of these metrics. And so those practitioner guides help. I think the software within the project is also what people rely on a good deal. It's in some ways critical to making sense of the metrics, to have data about the things you care about. So I think those two places seem like areas where the Chaos project is looking to develop and grow.
Yeah, and in addition to that, there are a few others too. Like we're currently looking at establishing Chaos metrics as international standards. So working through kind of some of those ISO processes, international standards organizations. So we haven't quite figured out how that's going to work, but we have a team of people who are working on that. And also, software as a service, SaaS solutions for Chaos metrics is another thing that's we think is going to be really important, because our tools, let's just face it, tend to be complex to maintain and keep running and collecting data. So we're trying to look at what kind of software as a solution models we can put together that allow us to do some of that in a way that other people can use our software without having to jump through too many hoops. So I would say that's probably another area that we're focused on.
So if you're talking to ISO already, as in the International Standards Organization, this is the world domination part, right?
Yes, exactly.
There you go. Okay, guys, this has been more than riveting, fascinating, and interesting. Links to the various GitHub repos of the software, of course, will be in the show notes. But before we wrap this up, there's always the POXs as the picks of the week. So this is something that has crossed your path recently with regards to the last couple of weeks that you find worth mentioning. Now, Martin normally covers adult entertainment websites rather than education websites, especially especially from an Amish background. I normally cover books or films or whatever. No, I mean, jokes aside, anything goes. So, ladies first, Dawn, what is your POX?
Yeah, so mine is an oldie but goodie. It's not necessarily something new, but Jupyter Notebooks, just because it's just such a nice way to explore data. And I've been using the Jupyter Notebooks pretty much constantly for the last 2 weeks as I explore some of this organizational participation data for the license changes and the forks that I was talking about earlier. So it's just such a nice tool for exploring data.
For those people who still program in Rust or Fortran or COBOL, what are Jupyter Notebooks?
Yeah,
mainly based on Python, so they probably wouldn't.
Exactly.
It is. Yes.
So
as a data scientist, I spend my life in Python.
Give us the 2-sentence lowdown.
Yeah, so it's basically an environment that allows you to interactively. You program, you write your little bits of code, and then you can really easily look inside those variables, look inside what's actually going on, and explore the variables as you decide what you're trying to do with the data. So it's a really good exploration tool. And I'll be honest, like anything that I explore in Jupyter Notebooks ends up being a Python script that I can more easily run and, produce reproducible code. But it's just such a nice way to look at each of the variables and look at what's going on and explore the data in a more interactive format before I take it and do something with it.
And it's widely adopted because it runs in your browser. It's available in the major GitHub source code repositories, and more companies, for example, like Databricks, are picking it up as the IDE of their choice. So if you actually develop any PySpark code, as in Python code that's running on Databricks' Spark, you're doing this actually in notebooks. So I reckon it's more or less a standard by now. And you can get it for other program languages as well. It was just the case that Python was first. Sean, over to you. What's your POX?
My POX is I could say artificial intelligence because it's the big, beautiful statue in the room that everybody's admiring.
The elephant, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the elephant, the statue. Yeah. It's but it's been around for 30 years. It's kind of make-believe, and I think digging into it, what I think with the large amount of data that we have collected and are trying to make sense of to understand open source health, I think Bayesian analysis is my POX. That looking at probabilities is more useful than trying to find absolutes, especially when you're staring at 100,000 repositories. So Bayesian analysis.
Sean, this is the hipster stuff, right? No neural networks, just applied statistics for a change.
Yeah.
When it comes down to machine learning, I'm impressed.
Probabilistic statistics are amazingly useful. And that's really all these other things are your deep learning, your AI. They're just extensions of these probabilities and computational linguistic algorithms that have been around for a while and now have machines capable of processing that amount of data. Now, we may not have power plants capable of running them all when we're done.
Meta, Google, if you're listening, PyTorch, TensorFlow, you want to pimp these frameworks.
Yes,
I'm joking.
Absolutely. They're good. It's good stuff.
No, I'm joking. I mean, I was just looking at some modeling recently, and it's just a perfect fit for that sort of algorithm. It doesn't have to be neural networks all the time. No, I fully agree. Plus the fact that these algorithms seem to be lighter on the hardware too, if I'm not completely mistaken, most of the time anyway. Mm-hmm. So I should probably sell my NVIDIA shares. I'm joking.
No. They're selling shovels. They're brilliant. NVIDIA's brilliant.
I'm joking, of course. Okay, Martin, over to you.
Yeah, so my pick of the week is actually a bit of software which is called Valky, which is going to have
Are you serious?
I am shocked.
Go ahead, Martin. What is Valky?
The reason is that I've been following this for the last few months, and I was quite surprised to see that the Valky 8's coming out completely independent of Redis, and people are adding, as I mentioned, multi-threading to it, which is quite a major improvement that Redis has been waiting for many years.
Salvatore probably wouldn't agree, let's put it this way, because there was some design rationale behind keeping Redis single-threaded.
But it's quite a nice solution that they've done.
And have you checked out the source code, whether it uses POSIX threads or something more historic? But it's still written in C, right? It's not C++ or some other hipster language, apart from Rust, of course.
It's true.
I think Rust is up and coming, but
I mean, it's still not there, right? Some of the modules use Rust, of course, and there's of course the FLOSS I'm talking about. This link's maybe in the show notes. So the Rust crate is actually already there. So I reckon COBOL and Fortran are next. I don't know. Sorry, Sean.
The U.S. government's pushing memory-safe languages pretty hard.
Yes.
So Rust has gotten a ton of love in the last 18 months, 2 years.
Yes, of course, there was a recent recommendation. Links will be in the show notes because I found this more than interesting. But I reckon Python was there too, if I'm not completely mistaken, right?
It's memory safe?
Yes.
Oh, I don't think of Python as memory safe. I'm going to have to look at that.
The government may be of a different opinion.
Yeah, maybe. Perhaps. I am not a shill for the U.S. government, you can tell.
Fair enough. No. I might be mistaken, but as I said, details may have up in the show notes. Okay, my POX is actually for a change of book. It's written by Christopher Moore, and it's called A Dirty Job. I won't give away too much, but if you like Terry Pratchett's Mort, you wouldn't be necessarily disappointed with reading that book. It's about a death messenger that comes across all sorts of shenanigans when doing his job. I'll leave it at that. It's hilariously funny. It's almost like Mort, if you've read that book. The humor is slightly different, but still very enjoyable. Links, of course, will be in the show notes. And with that, Dawn, Sean, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you.
That has been more than interesting. We must have you back, as I said, in a month to report on the Valky/Redis thing.
Okay. Happy to rejoin you with some kind of insights on that.
Great. No, and keep up the good work and very interesting project.
Thank you. This was a blast. Thanks for having us.
This is the Linux In-Laws.
You come for the knowledge,
but stay for the madness. Thank you for listening. This podcast is licensed under the latest version of the Creative Commons license, type Attribution Share Alike. Credits for the intro music go to Blue Sea Roosters for their song Solid Market, to Twin Flames for their piece called The Flow, used for the segment intros, and finally to Celestial Ground for their song Sweet Justice, used by the Dark Side. You find these and other ditties licensed under CC at Jamendo, a website dedicated to liberate the music industry from choking copyright legislation and other crap concepts.